Belgae are the bravest of the three peoples, being farthest removed from the highly developed civilization of the Roman province, least often visited by merchants with enervating luxuries for sale, and nearest to the Germans across the Rhine, with whom they are continually at war.
That's the sentence I
that
was
word.
thinking of.
What's the word?
It's the third sentence.
Yeah,
and the actual word he uses is effeminacy.
Effeminate. Yes.
Yeah.
What I have is enervating. Is that
it? Yeah. No.
Enervating.
The word he actually uses is feminandos there,
yeah.
and that's a very telling word.
Yeah.
That is Caesar has contempt for decadence. And that's the Rome that he reformed. That is, he saw the last days of Rome. Right. I think that's a more literal translation.
Yeah, I know. I'm not satisfied with that. Yeah. I read a modern translation.
Yeah, about the third. This is an old British 19th century, I think, again, translation, and it's quite very, very close to the almost word for word in Latin. Caesar saw that decadence, and he calls it an effeminacy. That soft luxury, and he himself. The reason I was reminded of that is, as you pointed out, that Caesar himself was a Spartan, a man. He slept on the ground, and he lived in a tent, and he ate with the soldiers, and they ate wheat that they ground with their own hand grinders, and they made a kind of flour out of it, and they made a bread, and that's what they lived on. They lived on water and bread, and occasionally they got wine if they could get it. But they were a Spartan people, and he holds up these barbarians as being better than the Romans.
Yeah, the Belgians, you see, he says they're the bravest. They're the farthest removed from the Roman province, and the Roman province brought. Well, it's the merchants, of course, that he blames. He says the merchants.
That oligarchic. You were talking about Caesar, the aristocrat.
Yeah.
And the oligarch was the one he.
Yeah, and frankly, it is the Republicans, that is the supporters of the Republic, including Cicero, whom we'll talk about later, who were really the class that was supported by the merchants, or that was of the merchants, the businessmen, you might say, the business community. They were the great supporters of the Republic, and Caesar sees that what they do, of course, is go out there and sell. Well, they do what the merchants did to the American Indians. They go out and sell them whiskey and ammunition, and above all of those things that are those things that render them weak rather than strong.
He uses two words here that are very telling in that same sentence. It's all one sentence. The way it reads here in this translation: of all these people, the Belgae are the most courageous, because they are furthest removed from the culture and the civilization of the Roman province, and least often visited by merchants introducing the commodities that make for effeminacy. Now, the words that he uses for furthest removed from culture and civilization are very curious words. Cultus and humanitas. That is, he has them in the ablative, removed from cultu atque humanitate. But we should stop just for a minute on those two words, culture and humanity. Isn't that the greatest word in the world? Caesar didn't like the humanities. That is, again, he's not a theoretician, he's not a philosopher, and what we do in our commentary is, I guess, we kind of philosophize upon what it is that he actually says there. He just wants to say something as clearly as he can say it, but if you reflect and ruminate a little bit on that word, we worship man. We worship ourselves. we use words like humane and everything is humanity. The worst crime in the world is a crime against humanity. We think that humanitas is the highest of virtues, and culture. That is culture in the sense of a cultivated man with all of the humane virtues of music and art and the city. Caesar didn't live in cities. His culture was a horse and a cloak and a sword and an army tent, the sky, the earth, say bread, not very much wine, mostly water. It's a Spartan ideal of culture in this sense, very Socratic, very much like the Republic.
And I would just add, it's a little bit of a digression, but I should add that Caesar was not himself a very robust man. He was not a big man.
Well, he was not a brute.
The Romans in general were relatively short. It used to be kind of a joke. You know, the Germans were great, big, strong, strapping kind of giants, and these little Italians, they were just little fellows. And Caesar himself was rather sickly. He didn't have good health. He suffered from seizures of what is it?
Epilepsy,
epilepsy.
Or at least that,
he had
yes.
epileptic fits, you know, and it left him. He was not a robust man by any means. Yet, as I don't want you to get the idea that Caesar was some sort of super athlete. He wasn't.
No.
He was not even a man of ordinary strength. But he lived that severe kind of life, which made him an exceptionally strong person, just in physical terms, with tremendous stamina.
I suppose it was in the will as much or more than it was in the body.
Yes, in the body, yes. It shows you.
But he had that contempt for what today, I'm afraid, we would call the humanities. When a student comes up, and we had something we called the humanities program, IHP we call it, the integrated humanities. And those are the things that make us most human or make us most humane. And Caesar really looks upon that as a danger when people get too much of the humanities. Now, he was a man who himself loved poetry, had studied philosophy, and inspired poetry. After all, he inspired the whole of the Aeneid. He was a man who himself liked music, but it was a poetry and a music and an art which was very, very close to the essentials, to what you remember Plato in the Republic opposes to the luxurious state. He calls it the economic state, the limited or minimal state. Caesar is on the side of the minimal, and it's very, very important, I think, to see that the virtues that we stress for the educated man or the cultivated man are those very things that Caesar sees as the beginning of the end.
Well, that word culture is a slippery word. It's used in at least three very, very distinct senses.
He's such a cultured man.
We usually use it, as someone who's we
effeminate. I think it becomes effeminate.
Yeah, we mean it's someone who loves art. Above all, someone who's a lover of art. A friend of mine. Well, we have the phrase that Caesar would like very much, the culture vulture. And there was a friend of mine wrote a little poem, a 2-line poem that was said, "The deader the culture, the better the vulture." He said, that is, you're talking about something that's not living when you're talking about that kind of culture. It's in museums. It's under glass. It's not a living thing at all. It's something. It's in art galleries. It's in symphony halls. It's not the music that you hear people singing in the field or on the dock. Or the music of the fiddler in the street. It's all been made for highbrows, as we say.
It's on stereo, finally.
Yeah, and finally it's on stereo, and that whole world of culture is we say effete. and effeminate. That's the sort of thing that Caesar sees.
In fact,
the
the second half of the sentence is even more shocking. I mean, the first half, he attacks things that we hold in the highest esteem. And then in the second one, he praises something that we think is the worst thing in the world. He says that the Belgians were the most courageous people because they had not been corrupted by the merchants with all this culture and all these humanities.
And just the material luxuries.
Material luxuries. And then he says, and also because they're nearest to the Germans, dwelling beyond the Rhine, with whom they are continually at war. In other words, the war made them strong. The best thing that can happen to a people is that they're continually at war. Caesar did not love peace. Now wait a minute. I mean, now maybe we've gone too far. I mean, when you put it in extreme ways, but that's what he says right there on the first page. That is that a nation at war has that sense of survival, has that sense that life is tough and we have to fight for what we get. But peace enervates. Somewhere way deep down in my memory, doesn't Shakespeare have some famous lines about that?
Oh,
something
yes, he
peace,
does. Well, it's in
softening or peace. Or
he's talking. I think you're thinking of the speech of Henry V, where he's talking about how in war he says you emulate the tiger. He says, but I can't remember what he says about peace. I think it's there that he makes the contrast. Maybe I don't know if that's what you have.
It is. That's the speech. That's the speech. And but he has some phrase about
the soft
peace, or it's a disparaging word. It's a disparaging some kind of peace, as if it makes people weak. And he says, show them the mettle of your pastures, show them that you've been fed on Scotch oats and and so on. That enervating peace. A nation which is at peace too long loses. Pretty soon the weapons hang on the wall and they become trophies. They become museum pieces. And the third and fourth generation looks at them and no longer knows how to use them. War becomes a game. It becomes a tournament, a show.
A spectacle. Then it becomes a sport.
A sport.
And you have, and eventually you have professional sports. The old-time cowboy who carried a pistol becomes a rodeo rider, which is a pretty tough life. But and then he joins the circus. Eventually he goes on TV.
But I remember the old cowboy writer Will James, who was a wonderful writer for boys around the age of 12 or so. He had a story about the rodeo cowboy who came out to the real cow camp, and he couldn't do it. He fell apart. He was so fancy, and he could ride the bucking horses better than anybody else, but he couldn't get through the day. He couldn't. It's a very, very good story.
Yeah. No, they have a kind of
all for show.
Yeah, it's all show, and they can do that for about as long as you can ride a bucking horse.
It's only
which is about 5 seconds.
That's right, 10 seconds, and the whistle blows.
But the cowboy goes out there and rides all day long. That's a different kind of thing altogether. But when war. Well, you can see it. It's perfectly obvious. This is not an original observation on our part at all. That is that when war ceases, when you get a condition of peace, then people look for artificial means that is, they look for artificial combat, which is what we mean by sports. The team sports are a form of warfare where. But it's a spectator sport too. That is, you have a few highly trained athletes who fight, but it isn't something that engages the actual activity of the whole nation by any means. And the spectators sit there and drink beer while they and eat popcorn while they watch these people down there battering.
A nation of spectators
circus
isn't going to survive. No, that's the circus.
That's the circus. The Roman circus eventually became that too. It was one of the signs of the end of the Roman Empire.
No, Caesar sees two things in one sentence there, right? In the very first page, and it's about the second sentence of the whole book. I was looking for it. I thought it was further down, but it's right at the start there. Enormously important place, the beginning of anything. And right there, he sets up two things. The economic success and war. And he says economic success is bad. That is the merchants and the effeminacy that it produces, and war is good. And we would have to say, gosh, that's utterly opposed to everything that's held up to us today for belief. And I think we'll have to leave it at that. Maybe we'll just have to say that it's a challenge to the imagination of any young person today to think about that.
Yeah, well, of course, you have to consider what this war is like, what this kind of warfare is like that Julius Caesar is conducting. These are soldiers. These are professional soldiers. These are men whose whole life has been dedicated to being soldiers, and they're the ones who are the backbone of the Roman nation. They have the highest status in the nation, and everyone recognizes that they depend upon these people to keep Rome a free and living nation.
I wish the Pope would write an encyclical on war. That is, he would, because it would be so offensive to the world today that it obviously wouldn't be prudent. But Christianity is a military religion. The idea of Christian pacifism is just about as absurd as Muslim pacifism. That is the crusade. The image of war, it's all over the place in St. Paul. I fought the good fight.
Put on the armor.
So, I mean, it's just everywhere. And if you want to find a kind of religious Julius Caesar, take a look at Paul. He lived very much like Caesar. Again, he was subject to seizures, so they say. Mm-hmm. The first one that we know about was the most famous, obviously, the ultimate seizure. But he was certainly not a well man. He was subject to some kind of an infirmity, he calls it, and we're not exactly sure what it was, but it does seem to be something like epilepsy. And he even made something of a spectacle of himself on one occasion, and he apologizes for it in one of the letters. He apparently fell down and jabbered or made some kind of a spectacle and embarrassed everybody, and was thought the worse for it. And so forth, and yet look what he did. That Spartan life, traveling everywhere, enduring shipwreck. That marvelous passage where he lists the things: stripes and jail and shipwreck. He says, "You want me to brag? All right, if you want me to brag, I don't brag for myself," he says, "but I'll tell you what I've done." And of course, he suffered, and he did. Snake bite on the island of Malta. I think you might say St. Paul is the Julius Caesar of the Christian life, and that's been lost sight of again. I think over the centuries of enervation that we have lived through in the last 100 years, war has become the ultimate abomination, and it's very difficult for anybody to understand that it could possibly be virtuous.
Well, the whole question is confused by the conditions of modern warfare.
Yeah, the bomb and the machines.
That makes it, of course,
gas,
muddles the whole question, because it is a form of warfare that Caesar would certainly despise.
It doesn't bring out those virtues at all.
Not at all. That is to fly through the air in a jet airplane and drop bombs on people that you can't even see. That's Caesar would say, well, that's just not war at all. That's something else. That's not one of the things that promotes virtue or strength or anything of the sort. It's just a kind of wholesale slaughter.
There's a book going the rounds now, which is the #1 bestseller. It's supposed to be an absolute blockbuster, and it was tooted about and recommended to me so highly that I sat down and read it. It's the first time I've read a bestseller in a long, long time, and it is very good. It's the guy's a genius at writing. But what you just said reminded me of that book. It's about 1,000 pages long. You know how bestsellers are; they're always huge things, and it's all about submarine warfare and how the scientists on the Russian submarines and the scientists on the American submarines sit there and work with the computers. That's really all they do. And they listen for sonar and all this highly complicated mathematical stuff. But in order to write a novel, when he gets down to the wire, where the novel has to come to its conclusion, guess what? There's a spy loose on the ship, and they have to take handguns and they have to chase. They have an old-fashioned, bang, bang, you're dead. It was right out of a Tom Mix movie. That is, in order to write a novel, in order to have a really exciting, it had to be hand-to-hand combat.
That's what it always comes down to. Yeah. They have all the technology. You see it in the movies.
That's all
this elaborate technology as a background. But then when it comes to the grand climax, you've got to have two enemies out there, hand-to-hand, fighting it out, That's what it is.
No, I guess you're right about the movies. That's even true of things like Star Wars. And so finally it comes down to a single combat between two guys with swords.
They with swords.
That's true. I mean, when we say that war can be thought as a virtue, it's pretty hard to see today.
Yeah.
It is pretty hard to see. And maybe that's one of the reasons why this book is so difficult. Just in the mail today, I got an advertisement from a teachers' society that helps teachers teach Latin. And one of the books, it said, "Do you find Caesar hard to teach? Do you find that you have failed to get it across? Well, this little book will help you to teach Caesar." And it has maps and charts and graphs and so on. And I thought, well, I guess the modern teacher who does try to teach Caesar does have a hard time. There's no doubt about it. And that is, when you read a sentence like that right from the start, the class is as likely to say, "Oh, well, I just don't believe that."
Yeah,
I just don't believe it.
No, I have had this experience with. We brought it up.
with good students, not.
We brought it up in the question of teaching the Iliad. I think perhaps the subject came up. I can't remember, but it's. I know I've fallen into a kind of despair about being able to teach the Iliad to students, even though you make
for the same
points,
reason, the heroism of war.
Yeah, they simply cannot. They've been so really brainwashed, I think, on the subject that they won't even listen to what you say about it. They just say war is bad. That's settled once and for all. Everybody knows that it's bad, and you cannot possibly say anything good about it.
And culture and humanity is good.
yes, that's what we all want above all as the perfect condition. But of course, you see, that is true. That is, Plato saw this too. That is, in the Republic, the ruling class in the Republic at the beginning is the soldier. They are the guardians of the state, and they live this kind of Spartan life, and they are trained to be soldiers. And when the state begins to fall, when it goes into its next stage, this society of the soldier begins to get a little bit weaker, and it gradually weakens through the various stages of society, from the oligarch, or from the timocrats down to the oligarchs, and finally to the democrats, to the democratic society, when there are no soldiers left at all. When everyone
there's a mob.
There's a mob, and everyone is weak.
You get riots, and you get terrorism.
Yes. No, this is very obviously the age of the riot, the kind of
it's interesting that the very students back in those days, and I suppose they're still around, the very ones who are the pacifists and who hate war love riots.
Yeah.
That is the violence. They deplore violence as a theoretical thing, but themselves fascinated by it. And their heroes are all terrorists, like Mao Zedong and Castro and so forth.
Well, I think you see this in our society right now, especially. That is, I feel very sure that is you see the riot as a characteristic feature of contemporary society. That is, it takes place at sporting events, it takes place at parties, it takes place.
They've ruined sports. Really, I mean, a thing like a basketball game has become a riot.
Well, I go to the basketball games, and you always feel that you're right on the verge of a real riot, where people start throwing bottles and start slugging one another. You're right on the edge, and of course, at football games, it happens all the time. And the other night. Here in Lawrence, Kansas, there was a kind of brawl up in the student union that broke out at the dance. And it was a fight, and there were windows broken and that sort of thing, but there were also guns. There were guns. People had guns. There were shots fired. The police are still kind of running this down. There were weapons that were used, and this was just some sort of stupid sorority fraternity party.
These are students who are all against war.
Oh, yes, all of them are against war. But the riot, they've had these after football games here in the state of Kansas, which is.
I mean, these are not revolutionary students.
No, not at all. These are very conservative students who are all in the School of Business, and are going to be.
No, it's a psychological state, of total frustration. That is, a young man, we've talked somewhat on these tapes, I think, about the 7 ages of man. Youth is soldier. That's what he is. Shakespeare calls him the soldier. And when a man gets to be beyond 18 years old, he is a soldier. And our society doesn't permit that. It's totally frustrated. There's no way that can be exercised. And men finally are going to revolt. There's going to be a kind of psychological revolt. They're made effeminate. They're made to act as if they weren't men. And by golly, what they do is they riot.
Yeah, that's the last stage. You get sports, you see, which is a sort of organized combat. It's a substitute for combat. But then, you see, it works out perfectly. That is, out of that comes the riot. The big soccer riots that they have in Europe.
Hundreds of people were killed, especially the British. They've turned out to be the worst. Yeah. The most conservative people by nature in Europe. Yes. In a way, the most
law-abiding, civilized in every way.
And yet they were the most brutal. Those kids from Manchester and Leeds, or wherever those teams were from, they tore the stands down and killed hundreds of people.
Yeah, no, it was. But that's you can see exactly that is that. Then you're in the state that we call democracy, where where everyone is out in the street fighting. It's no longer a nation at war, but it's all internalized now. It's every man for himself. It's a free for all. In that idea of freedom, it turns back on itself. You're free to do anything you want to, and it turns out that it means that it's kind of free fighting, as they call it. Street fighting is what you get.
I mean, here's a passage: at dawn, Labienus was in possession of the summit of the height, and Caesar was no more than 1.5 miles from the enemy's camp. And as he learned afterwards from prisoners, neither his own approach nor that of Labienus was discovered. At this moment, Considius galloped back to him, saying that the mountain he had wished Labienus to seize was in possession of the enemy. He knew it by the Gallic arms and badges. Caesar withdrew his own troops to the nearest hill and formed a line of battle. Labienus had instructions from Caesar not to join battle unless his own troops appeared near the enemy's camp, so that a simultaneous assault might be made upon the enemy from all sides. Accordingly, having seized the height, he awaited the main body and refrained from engaging. At length, when the day was far spent, Caesar learnt from his scouts that the height actually was in possession of his own troops after all, and that the Helvetians had shifted their camp, and therefore that Considius, in sheer panic, had reported to him as having seen that which he had not. Now, I just take that as a paragraph typical of Julius Caesar. I just think that's marvelous. You just have to say to any young man in his 20s, how could you not be attracted to a thing like that? And poor Considius, his name is going to go down for 2,000 years as as the guy that saw what was not there because he panicked. On the morrow, as no more than 2 days remained before it was proper to issue the corn ration to the troops, and as he was no more than 18 miles from Bibrac. Now, Bibrac is the first big battle of this whole book. There's a map of it in here, and it's not far from Dijon, where they make the mustard in France, and you can visit the site. It's been dug up, and the arrowheads have been found, and some of the spears. It's one of the great, the first big battle that Caesar fights with the barbarians, as soon as Caesar remarked this situation, he withdrew his troops to the nearest hill and sent the horse to check the enemy's charge. Meanwhile, he himself drew up his 4 legions of veterans in a triple line halfway up the hill, but he ordered the 2 legions which he had enlisted in Nirogol and all of the auxiliaries to be posted on the top of the ridge so as to fill the hillside entirely with men. In the meantime, the packs were collected in one place, which was to be entrenched by the troops posited in line on higher ground. The Helvetians followed with all their carts and collected their baggage in one place. The fighting men, in a densely crowded line, repulsed the Roman horse and then formed a mass and moved up against our first line. Caesar had first his own horse and then those of all others sent out of sight, thus to equalize the danger for all and to take away all hope of flight. Now you do have to stop and realize what kind of a man Julius Caesar was. Notice how spontaneous all this is. He didn't have a battle plan. As he was misinformed by Considius about who had which hill, when he found out that it was wrong, he had no problem. He said, "Well, if they're not there, then we'll go there." That is, he was open to the surprise, everything. A man who had a fixed plan couldn't do that. He would have already said, "Well, we'll do this and we'll do that." And then this marvelous sentence about the horses. Julius Caesar himself got off his horse and sent him away so that he was on foot with his own men, exposed to all the dangers and the impossibility of flight. The worst thing to an enlisted man is to think, I'm going to go out here and kill myself, and those damn officers are all going to get on their horses and ride away. Do you remember in those old days, my own military experience is kind of a joke, and I can't claim anything serious. But I was in the Army at least long enough to get a sense of that. On a long march, when those damn guys went by in their jeeps and in their squad cars, with their radios, all the resentment, the hatred you got, Julius Caesar was down there with his men. And they knew that. They knew that. Take away all hope of flight. Then, after a speech to encourage his troops, he joined battle. The battle is described in concrete detail. Generations of school children have memorized this passage, and it's in the imagination of Western civilization. We don't have time, I guess, to read it. You read it. You read it. But when the barbarians came up that hill to charge against the Romans, they came up with their shields locked so as to make a wall. It was a characteristic method of attack. They stood in a close, packed mass and held up their shields overlapped and hid behind them, so that when the Romans shot arrows at them and threw javelins at them, they could keep marching right up. Well, Caesar had the javelin throwers throw the javelins in such a way that it pinned the shields together, went right through the place where they were overlapped, and then those guys couldn't get rid of their shields, and they were trapped in their own advance.
That's kind of a parable of that. kind of fixity of approach that you see often in that the military men get the idea that there is a fixed way of doing things. They got caught in their own plan.
I should have more confidence again in Julius Caesar. He said that quicker than I was going to save time, and he said it quicker than I did. The Gauls were greatly encumbered for the fight because several of their shields would be pierced and fastened together by a single javelin cast. And as the iron became bent, they could not pluck it forth nor fight handily with their left arm encumbered. Therefore, many of them preferred, after continued shaking of their arms, to cast the shields off altogether and fight bare-bodied.
Yeah.
Well, then they had them.
Yeah.
Then they had them. And he does that in one sentence with that tremendous economy. But what a vivid piece of writing that is. But backing off from the writing, what a vivid piece of life that is for a young man. And it's true today. We're cut off from that. Young men go to, as you say, they go to football games, they go to basketball games, and they sit there and they drink beer. And this is the life that they're ready to live. Their bodies are ready, their minds are ready, and they're not ready for anything else.
Yeah, no, they're not ready to go to school.
No,
really,
they're not ready for philosophy.
They're not ready for philosophy. That's right.
And they're not ready for politics. See, the communists recruit them into the party and get them into all kinds of, nonsense about pacifism and all that sort of thing. They have no mind for politics at all. But politics calls for prudence, calls for experience. No, what they need is a war, and we haven't gotten one. And I don't want to come on here as a militarist. It may be that with modern warfare we can't have one. I don't know. I mean, it may be that we've got so far into the machine age that war is impossible. But if so, then youth is impossible. That is, we've exterminated 20 years of a man's life. 15 years, anyway, of a man's life, from about 20 to 35. But Julius Caesar is the book of youth. These passages where he describes those things are just so immediately appealing. That word "appeal" is a good word. You remember one year when we were looking for a picture to put on our brochure, we got the bugle. We got the
horse with the man.
And that's the appel. Yeah. That's the bugle call. The word appeal means it's the same as a bell, pealing. It's the same word. It means a call to action. And one of the reasons why this book has been the book of the college, the book of high school, the first Latin book that the student ever read, around the age of 16 actually, was to get him ready to move into that age of youth where he would go out and in one way or another he'd fight the good fight. If he were a priest, he'd imitate St. Paul. He'd be a missionary. He'd be fighting the good fight, preaching to the infidel. If he were a soldier, of course, he'd actually be fighting. But no matter what he was at that age, he'd be called to some kind of action. And Julius Caesar is the book.
No, it's
above all,
it's very obvious
that appeals.
That we can only get that appeal now through a kind of secondary experience. This is, as Mr. Senior was saying, this is very immediate. This kind of life that they are engaged in is very immediate, and that the reason that this has been studied is because it's a kind of preparation for that kind of life. But now what we have are substitutes, you see, for that kind of life. Not only sports, but in movies. All of the films about warfare are tremendously popular right now, and it's funny. The commentators all think that it's because these wars very often have an anti-war theme in them. But that's not what makes them popular.
That's not why the kids go.
That's not why they go. That's not why the young people go.
No, they cheer.
They love the sheer sight of this warfare. they revel in it. And it's the same with the enduring popularity of, well, cops and robbers films are very, very popular right now, and it's the sheer excitement of that kind of combat between good and evil, of going out there and fighting, that draws people into it and excites them. But unfortunately, it prepares them for nothing. There isn't anything to prepare for. Instead, what it becomes is a substitute for that kind of life.
Yeah, I mean, even as I say, even 50 years ago, it might not have been actually a war, but no matter what you did, it was a kind of war. That is, if you got a job of any kind, if you went to work for the railroad, or you were fighting kind of a fight. That is, there was something physical. You were out there on the line doing some kind of thing. You might go to sea. You might be on a ship. But whatever a young man did, there was that sense that he was in some kind of combat. And today, that's not true. That is, no matter where you go, I don't know how many college graduates I've talked to. I was just talking to a group the other day, and how sad they do seem to me to be. There was a popular song, one of these blousy, they called it cool jazz songs, about 10 or 15 years ago now, called Old Sad Young Man. Very good title. And a song so dreary I couldn't listen to it. Just terrible. But it caught the imagination of that kind of a young guy who had just graduated from the Harvard Business School and was looking forward to what? To going into some huge corporation where you fit into it, where really pacifism was a virtue. If you were aggressive, you were defeated. You'd be removed.
Well, it's all, again, it's a kind of, there still is a kind of combat. It's very abstract. That is, it's.
But wouldn't those virtues actually would hold you back?
Yeah.
I mean, the military virtue, you wouldn't get promoted.
No, you certainly don't want daring, boldness at all. You want to learn the system and learn
how to work it, learn how to do it, go by the book, play it safe. I mean, we've seen that in our university lives. The kind of people that become the deans and the important people are all. You can't get them to fight.
No, that's exactly the point. You can insult them. You can go out and kick them, and they are incapable of anger. That's how they got the job.
We were almost in stitches laughing at it. And one of the administrators here at the University of Kansas some years ago now, it must have been 10 or 15 years ago, when the student radicals were just raising hell, and they were insulting that man. They called him names, and he was, yes, well, thank you very much, yes, not next, and he just stood up there, and it was unbelievable that he absolutely did not react. And that was considered, oh boy, everyone said, well, he was good.
He kept his cool, they said. You see, did you see how he kept his cool? That was considered admirable.
I forget what it was, but somebody insulted him right to his face in some incredible way. And I thought, well, that does it. He's going to throw that guy out. Not at all.
Well, what he said to him was something like, you don't have any guts. That's what he said. And he thought, well, that's kind of the ultimate insult, and it is the ultimate insult to a man. But he proved his point. He said, yes, well, you're right, I don't. I certainly congratulate you on seeing the truth about things.
But in the modern business world or whatever the world is, even the modern military world, this is what scares you. These are the fellows that become the generals, I'm afraid, even today. Well, all the more important to read this book and to savor it. I noticed that I don't know whether the tape is going to pick this up again, but our hounds are straining at the leash down there. I don't know, we've had birds on this tape, and we've had all kinds of things. I'm sure we've had the dogs, haven't we?
Yes.
So everybody knows that they're there. I think we can outlast them.
We're just about
because we're just about done. One of the things I did want to say is that one of the most important things about this book is It's its geography. That is, we were just talking about how direct and immediate and real all this is. And you can go to the places. Those of you who are in Europe or who can get to Europe, whatever you do when you go there, go to these places and stand on that ground. I remember I got a picture from one of our old students who is now a monk at Rondeau in France, and he sent a little picture of a group of the monks who were standing. I think it was a religious procession, as I remember. They were walking by, and he had snapped a picture of them, and he sent it to me. And he said on the back, he said, "By the way, that blue mound that you see there in the background, that's the hill where Caesar lost his only battle, where I think it was Ariovistus actually defeated him in one of the, And you just say, oh, gee, that's marvelous. That is marvelous. That is, we're talking here about Europe. We're talking about Western civilization, but we're not talking about ideas. We're not talking about abstractions. We're talking about real hills,